Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kambiz Ranavardi, co-president of Columbia, DC, and a graduate of the School of Engineering and Applied Science. I also happen to be a former member of technical staff at the Bell Labs, just like our panel today, of course, with very more modest list of accomplishments. First, let me thank our partners who helped plan and promote this event, School of Engineering and Applied Science, as well as Columbia Alumni Association. Thank you. We are very privileged and honored to have the opportunity to host a conversation with the 2020 ACM Turing Award winner, Alfred Aho, Lawrence Gossman, Professor Emeritus of Computer Science at Columbia University. And this will be in conversation with Professor Mihalis Yannakakis, Percy K. and Vida L. Hudson, Professor of Computer Science at Columbia. Please allow me to briefly introduce our speakers, but I would encourage everyone to check our website for their full bios and a more complete list of their accomplishments. Alfred Aho is the Lawrence Gossman Professor Emeritus of Columbia Science at Columbia. He served as chair of the Department of Computer Science from 95 to 97, and again in the spring of 2003. Professor Aho has received the ACM Turing Award and the IEEE John von Neumann Medal. He's a member of the U.S. National Academy of Engineering and of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, as well as a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, ACM, Bell Labs, and IEEE. Professor Aho's research interests have included programming languages, compilers, algorithms, software engineering, and quantum computation. He has served as chair of the Computer Science and Engineering section of the National Academy of Engineering, as chair of the ACM's Special Interest Group on Algorithms and Computability Theory, and twice as chair of the Advisory Committee for the National Science Foundation's Computer and Information Science and Engineering Directorate. Our host, Professor Mihalis Yannakakis, works on the theoretical foundation of computing, seeking to understand the inherent computational complexity of problems and to design efficient algorithms for their solutions. His activities include, among other things, research in combinatorial optimization, which includes developing efficient approximation algorithm for hard optimization problems, characterizing the limits of approximability, and investigating trade-offs in multi-criteria optimization. In algorithmic game theory, which includes studying the computation of equilibria for games and markets and algorithms for pricing and mechanism design. In modeling, including verification and testing of reactive systems, and in databases, including query processing and concurrency control. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering, of Academia Europaea, and of the National Academy of Sciences, a recipient of the Knut Prize, a fellow of the Association for Computing Machinery, and a Bell Labs fellow. So without further ado, Professor Yannakakis, Professor Aho, please take over.
Thank you very much for inviting me to host this event with Alejo. Al received recently the Turing Award, which is known as the Nobel Prize of Computing. It's the top award in our field. And this is a great honor for Columbia University and the Department of Computer Science. And it's a great honor for me to have this conversation with Alejo. So I know Al for many years. I was worked with him at Bell Labs first. He was, and then at Columbia University. So it's a person I have admired throughout. So it's a role model for me, as he is for many other younger computer scientists. So To start with, I would like to ask, I'll go back a little in time and I ask him to reflect, when he was starting to his studies. I know he's first got his degree in engineering physics at Toronto, and then went to Princeton, and then went into computer science. So I'd like to ask him, how did you decide to go into computer science, which was a young field at the time?
Well, thank you for the introduction, Mihalis, and thank you everyone for joining in on this conversation. It's always a privilege for me to be able to talk to Mihalis because he and I have shared interests, and I've always learned so much in conversations with him. The question was, how did I get involved in computer science? Well, as Mihalis mentioned, I was an undergraduate at the University of Toronto taking engineering physics. And for my senior thesis, I had done a paper on the minimization of Boolean circuits. And I kind of liked the problem because it was mathematically interesting and practically important. But I really didn't solve it to my satisfaction. And I really didn't know what I wanted to do with my life after my undergraduate degree. So I chose the easiest course of action, and that is stay in school as long as possible. So what I did was I looked for where would be good places to go after Toronto. And there was always MIT, of course, which is one of the premier places to study computer science. But there was a professor at Princeton University by the name of Ed McCluskey, who was at that time the doyen of minimization of Boolean functions. He had developed a heuristic with Quine. So the Quine-McCluskey algorithm was the standard way of trying to minimize Boolean functions and Boolean circuits. And all I ever got from MIT were forms to fill out. And McCluskey kept writing me these personal letters saying, well, why don't you come to Princeton and study with me and we can solve this field together. So after a while, I said, why should I go to this university that treats me like a form when I can go to Princeton and study with this great man? So I decided to go to Princeton for my PhD. And not too long after I got to Princeton, McCluskey left. Stanford hired him. And what Princeton did was it hired this young assistant professor by the name of John Hopcroft to join the electrical engineering faculty at Princeton. And he became my advisor. And McCluskey was not that much older than I was. He had only one research problem. And thank goodness he gave the research problem to the second other student that he inherited from McCluskey. This was a problem that took the research community almost 30 years to solve. And he told me, Al, why don't you find your own research problem? And that was perhaps the best advice that he could have given me, because once you graduate, you don't have somebody giving you research problems to work on. You have to think about them for yourself. And in the first few months at Princeton, after I got Hopcroft as a thesis advisor, I was tearing my hair out trying to find a suitable research problem to work on. But after a while, I came across the idea of trying to find a generalization of context-free grammars that could model more of the syntactic constructs in programming languages. And so I devised a formalism called index grammars and found that there was an automaton analog for index grammars, just the same way that push-down automata or an automaton or an analog for context-free grammars, and they recognize the same expressions. After getting my PhD from Princeton, I finally had to make a decision. I need to go and find a job somewhere. So there was a place not too far from Princeton called Bell Labs that had just a fabulous reputation in research at the time. It was full of bright people, Nobel laureates. And when I interviewed there, my boss, who was Doug McElroy, the co-inventor of macros, and had done some very significant work in computing already. He was a graduate of MIT, by the way. But he said to me, Al, why don't you come and work at Bell Labs, and you should work on what things you consider to be important. And I said, gee, maybe I can handle that job charter. And that was one of the best decisions I made of joining Bell Labs. My colleague and friend from Princeton, Jeff Ullman, who had just graduated a few months earlier than me, had joined Bell Labs as well. And I had just a great time at Bell Labs because it was rife with interesting research problems, the opportunity to interact with brilliant people. So it was a researcher's nirvana. And I might say that I was very pleased when Mihalis joined the Computing Science Research Center, which I had joined a little bit later, because the people and the environment were as good as one could find anywhere for doing research in computer science in that period of time. So that is perhaps a much too long an answer to this question of how I got into computer science and how I got into Bell Labs, but I'm very glad I did.
Right, yeah. Yeah, and at Bell Labs, there was, I guess that was, you went there, Jeff Ullman, Brian Kernighan from Princeton went there, and lots of some other famous people like Dennis Ritchie and Ken Thompson joined. So it must have been a very exciting place. Where did you get your problems there? Was that problems coming from the company, from the Bell system, or you would generate your own tools, your own problem agenda?
Well, this is a very good question and a very important question of what should you work on? And somehow or another over the years, I felt that you should only work on important problems. And I also, when I later became into management, thought that if you relied on your boss to give you research problems to work on, neither your boss nor you were doing your job properly, because the most important research contributions seem to always be done by young people early in their career, and that the whole purpose of management should be to get out of the way and give advice when advice is necessary, but let these young people work out these important problems. And in the environment that we were in at that time, the Unix operating system was just being developed by Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie. And there was a new programming language that was being created by Dennis Ritchie called C. And I had a fondness for programming languages and looking at algorithms to translate programming languages into target programs, compilers. So in this environment, it was very interesting to try to develop both algorithms for use in programming language compilers, and also looking at new languages to create with which you can solve problems much more readily than with existing languages at the time. So I found the combination of theory and practice, the theory of programming language translation, and the algorithms involved in efficiently translating programs in programming languages into target programs, a very enticing research area. Jeff Ullman was also interested in the same area, and we decided to look into this area as deeply as we could. So one of the first things that we did was, in some sense, a literature search of what's known about this field of programming languages, compilers, and translators. So we decided that we'd try to codify and put together what was known about programming language translation from a theoretical point of view. And Jeff and I wrote this 2-volume book, The Theory of Parsing, Translation, and Compiling in the early 70s, which sort of took a look at the theory of the field. And then using the theory of the field, we decided that we could try to extend some of the theory, the theoretical techniques, the algorithms, and create with our colleagues tools that could be used to create components of compilers. And we had some very interesting collaborations with some of our colleagues, like Steve Johnson, who was interested in creating a C compiler for a new language. And he came to me and asked, Al, how do you construct parsers, syntax analyzers? And this gave me an opportunity to introduce him to a method of parsing called shift-reduce parsing, or LRK parsing, that Don Knuth had invented at Stanford, except Don Knuth's basic formulation of LR parsing led to parsers that were humongous inside. So Jeff Ullman, Steve Johnson, and I decided to refine Knuth's LR parsing algorithm into being able to produce parsers that could be quickly generated and would be efficient. And this led to a tool that Steve Johnson implemented called YAC. Jeff coined the term yet another compiler for YAC. And YAC became one of the prime methods for constructing syntax analyzers for compilers for many decades. In fact, YAC is still found in many different instantiations on today's operating systems. And there was another person who was interested in lexical analysis techniques, Michael Lesk, and he had created a program for producing lexical analyzers. And lexical analysis is one of the first phases of a compiler. At that time, Bell Labs had a summer internship program, and there was a very bright young intern by the name of Eric Schmidt, who took a look at some of the regular expression pattern matching techniques that I had created and installed them into the second version of Michael Lesk's lexical analyzer tool called Lex. And that with the combination of Lex and YAC, you could experiment with creating front ends for compilers for new programming languages. And these became sort of standard tools with which our colleagues in the Computing Science Research Center created many new little languages. Brian Kernahan was particularly enamored of creating new little languages. He created a language for typesetting mathematics with Lorinda Cherry called EQN. And his model of developing a language for typesetting mathematics was, you should describe mathematics the way a mathematician would describe a mathematical formula on the telephone to another mathematician. Don Knuth, who developed the TeX typesetting system, liked this notation so much, he incorporated it into his typesetting language, TeX, and TeX and its derivative LaTeX are used throughout the scientific community for typing scientific papers that have a lot of mathematics in them. And so I found programming languages to be just a very fertile field for creating new abstractions, experimenting with abstractions for solving problems, and also looking at fruitful techniques for being able to translate these languages into target programs. And as you're well aware, almost all of software is created by first writing programs in some higher level language and then using some kind of language translator to translate it into target machine code that gets executed. So this was a very practical area. And one of the things that I learned from the people at Bell Labs, particularly Richard Hamming, who said that in order to be a great researcher, it's necessary for you to do great research, but you have to teach others how to practice your research. So Jeff and I found that writing books about the techniques of language translation and the algorithms that are involved in it was a very good way of trying to teach others what we have done with our research. And these books, as you may know, Jeff had this idea that a book needs a great cover. So he proposed the idea of having a dragon representing the complexities of a compiler design on the cover. And then the dragon would be fought by a knight in shining armor with a lance, and the lance and the various parts of the knight's armor were armed with the great techniques that we were investigating into compiler design. So this book got to be known as the Dragon Book, and it got written in 3 successive versions, first by Jeff and me initially in 1977, and then in the mid-1980s, we were joined by Robbie Sethi, who was another member of the Computing Science Research Center as a co-author. The first Dragon book had a green dragon on it. The second Dragon book had a red dragon book on it. And one of the things that I'm particularly fond of is that the red dragon book was shown in the 1995 movie Hackers that had a young Angelina Jolie in it. And when my children saw the cover of the book flashed on the screen of the movie, they for the first time thought that their old man must be really something in order to have his book shown in a movie, because they didn't think much of the books when they were lying around the house.
Right. That's when the accomplishment became real to the children.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. So the books is actually one big big contribution to to generations of computer scientists, because both the Dragon book, the algorithms book, and the other books have taught many generations of computer scientists. Is that how do you see the books relating to your research? Were they feeding off each other? Were they triggering your research, or was that a way to organize? Of course, it's a way to organize the knowledge to know what is to do next, right?
Well, one of the benefits of writing a book is, as you're writing the book, you discover that there are lots of open problems that the research community hasn't addressed. So it provides a framework in which to develop a theory and a field. Because if you're successful in solving some of these open research problems that you've uncovered as you're writing the book, you start to develop a reputation in that field. So one of the advice that I always give to new researchers is, if you get a chance, write a book. And if the book is successful, you will become known as a guru in that field. And I also was teaching out of hours when I first joined Bell Labs at Stevens Institute of Technology. And I used my course notes to help develop some of the material that was going into the books. So I found doing research, teaching, and writing to be extremely synergistic. And this helped shape my ideas, generate new ideas. And it also brought home the point that it's very good to be able to communicate to your audience, both orally and in writing. So communication skills are very valuable for anyone, no matter what their field is. And writing books and teaching are very good ways of improving your communication skills. I remember the first time I had to give a scientific paper at a conference, I was petrified. I thought I'd be exposed as somebody who doesn't know anything about the field. And there were all these august people like Richard Karp in the front row, and I was in awe of them. But after a while, I discovered that if you could explain your ideas simply and in a comprehensive way, but in simple terms to a broad audience, this would also help enhance your research reputation. So I've encouraged my students, especially when I came to Columbia, that learning how to talk about your work and write about your work is very good for your career. So I forced all of the students in my programming languages and translators course to do a lot of talking and writing about compilers and programming languages. They initially hated this, but after a while they said, yeah, I think it's very important to be able to talk about my work. And especially as they were implementing their own programming language in a small team, that they could describe their programming language to their teammates in terms that they could understand was essential for a successful term project that they had to do for the course.
Yeah, so that I guess you applied that actually in the courses you were teaching then at Columbia. So in '95, you moved to Columbia, to academia. Was that what were the factors that made you decide to make the transition? And how did that change your life?
Well, it is that's a very good question. My life plan actually was to spend the last third of my career teaching and working with students. Jeff Ullman, my colleague, also had a similar plan, but since he's smarter than I, he left Bell Labs much earlier and went to Princeton, and then from Princeton to Stanford. So he spent almost all of this research career in academia, whereas I only spent the last third of my research career in academia. I was also involved in getting promoted into management at Bell Labs, and I preferred to do research than being in management. So that may have been also a stimulus in saying, hey, it's about time to fulfill my life plan of moving to academia and teaching and working with students. And I found my years at Columbia actually very satisfying and delightful. The only thing I didn't like about Columbia was the 2-hour commute that I had from my home in Chatham, New Jersey to to Columbia in New York City through Penn Station. But I had a 5-minute commute from my house to Bell Labs in Murray Hill, New Jersey. So that was the downside of Columbia, but being able to work with the students and be able to interact with my colleagues at Columbia made up for it.
Right, yeah. And you must have enjoyed it a lot because you got a bunch of great teacher awards. So that's something
Well,
you know that you were meant to do. So, sorry. You want to say
One
something?
of the things I might mention is that my favorite course, Programming Languages and Translators, I arranged that the students form a team of 5, and each team was to create their own innovative new programming language and write a compiler for it in the course of a semester. At the beginning of the semester, the students thought I was out of my gourd, saying, not only does he want us to create a new programming language, but he expects us to write a compiler for it. But this project had 2 other life skills other than communication, of learning how to talk and write about compilers and programming languages. One of the life skills is project management. I had each team elect a project manager, and the other life skill was teamwork. You had to learn how to work with your teammates. And once you graduate, you discover that in life, no matter where you are, you're going to have to work with others. So learning how to work with others is an important life skill. And frequently you'll be called on to lead projects. So learning how to lead a project is also a very good life skill. And at the end of the course, I had the students write a 100-page report on describing the programming language and the compiler that they wrote. But the last chapter of the report was lessons learned. What are the most important things you learned in this course? Very rarely would the students say any principle or algorithm or theory about programming languages or compilers, but they would say such things as project management is a real, pardon the phrase, bitch, because they didn't realize how hard it was to manage other students. Or another comment was, I didn't realize it was so hard to work with other students. And I would then mention to them, but these are Columbia students. Wait till you graduate and you discover some of the other people you're going to have to be able to work with once you graduate. But during the course of the projects, if you do work on something very intensely, you get to know people very well. And one of the most fun and interesting projects I've worked in my life was creating a little language that got to be known as Aho with Brian Kernahan and Peter Weinberger. And we created this language just to help us out. We had a number of simple routine data processing problems of keeping track of budgets or editorial correspondence or grades, things of this nature. And
I used to walk quite a bit when I run conferences, to tabulate results and, So that's it's quite a fun language, yeah.
It was really something that we wanted to create for ourselves. And we didn't want to write several 100-line C programs to do this routine data processing. So we created this language which allowed you to be able to express these data processing tasks with a few lines of Aho code. And we discovered that almost all of our colleagues had, in the Computing Science Research Center and at Bell Labs, had similar routine data processing problems. So Aho became one of the most widely used applications on Unix in the beginning. And in fact, there was one person in the microelectronics division at Bell Labs who wrote a 1,000-line Aho program to implement a VLSI CAD system because he found programming in it so easy. So it also gave us an opportunity to experiment with how do you express algorithms, routine algorithms concisely. And it also gave me an opportunity to use some of my regular expression pattern matching programs because we used regular expressions to specify the syntax of strings and patterns. So Aho is basically a pattern action language. you specify a bunch of patterns, and associated with each pattern is an action. If you find that pattern in an input file, you execute the associated action. Human beings are very stimulus response creatures. If you hear a loud noise, you turn your head in the direction of the loud noise. So it was a very natural programming paradigm for people to learn. And we just generalized the grep program, which looked for string patterns, to be able to deal with strings and numbers. And it's amazing how much of life is just strings and numbers as these patterns. And then the actions were little rudimentary C programs. And since everybody knew C in the Computing Science Research Center, it was a very easy language to pick up. I might mention that the reason the language got to be called awk was whenever our colleagues saw the three of us, Kernahan, Weinberger, and I, in an office talking about what to put into the language or how to design it, they go walking by the door and chant, awk, awk. We couldn't do anything other than call the language awk after we finished.
Right, yeah, so for those people that don't know it, awk are it's an acronym, the initial letters of the authors.
Yes.
For Aho. Now, looking now forward, the computer science is by now, I don't know, 60-year-old field. I mean, and maybe more. Okay. And you and other pioneers have set the foundations of the field. Of course, it has grown a lot since then. Now it is, computing has entered all walks of life. It's a much bigger enterprise than when it started. What do you think? How do you see the future of the field? What are the new directions? What is the prospects of the field in the future?
It's a question that I get asked a lot. And
I'm sure.
Computer science wasn't a fully created field when I entered academia, or entered Princeton. It was just a program in the EE department, a digital systems program. Computer science departments were starting to be created in academia at that time. Now, as you point out, almost everyone wants to study computer science because they think they can get jobs in the area. Computer science has impacted almost every field of human endeavor, as you've pointed out. What's also interesting about computer science is that I think it's becoming more and more interesting with the passage of time because its applications to other disciplines create new opportunities for abstractions and how you think about problems. I'm a big fan of computational thinking, a term that was popularized by Jeanette Wing in 2006 by her influential article in the Communications of the ACM. And Jeanette and I have talked about how should one define the term computational thinking. My favorite definition for computational thinking is finding the right abstractions for a problem area. So then you can solve problems in that abstraction area with computation and algorithms. So abstractions and algorithms are the two basic ingredients of computational thinking. Well, abstractions and algorithms are also the two basic ingredients in my book of computer science. The first sentence in the algorithms book that Prof. Ullman and I wrote was, algorithms are at the very heart of computer science. And I think many of us, you might even agree with that, because algorithms are everywhere. computational thinking has been expanded to try to apply to other areas of science, and in fact, other areas of human endeavor, of what are the right abstractions with which to think about a domain, a set of problems, and then how to solve them using those abstractions. So as we look at computer science and we look at where the field is moving, artificial intelligence has become one of the premier application areas for computer science. And artificial intelligence and machine learning in particular, a subfield of artificial intelligence, is being used to revolutionize techniques for solving problems. Artificial intelligence programs can play better chess and Go than people. Artificial intelligence programs can do, in certain cases, better jobs of diagnosing skin elements than doctors can. AI programs can do a better job of recognizing pictures than human beings. And it's a very intriguing question of how far can AI and machine learning be extended. One of the great problems in computer science, from my perspective, is can we construct a chat box that behaves like a sentient being? We look at chatbots like Siri or Alexa, and we can talk to them in a very limited fashion. But there is a lot of interest in trying to extend these chatbots into more conversational assistants that can be used by customers to query about products, order new products. Maybe, in fact, they could be used to educate customers and their users. We are still a long way from being able to construct chatbots that are equivalent to skilled humans who are supposed to help people. So lots of open problems in that area. If we look at computational biology, I think that's a fascinating area that's still open for lots of interesting problems. Can we construct algorithms for precision medicine where we can design medical procedures and treatments individualized to people using the best knowledge that the medical community has available? And I think the holy grail, at least what I've been intrigued by, is can we construct a sentient robot that has consciousness? The big problem in this area is that the medical community or the neuroscience community doesn't have a good definition for the term consciousness. But maybe people like Christos Papadimitriou, who is intrigued by this question as well, will get some young students to make great strides in this area. But I don't know whether we'll get a full answer to what is consciousness, and certainly not in my lifetime, but
right.
Ever.
Yeah, that's a broad, I guess, it's a broad question. So maybe we can get to some of the questions that the audience has been asking. That actually relates to some of the questions. For example, there is one more question specifically about AI, but I think you have kind of answered it. And Tony Thompson asks, where is AI going and how soon will it get there? I think you have kind of given somewhat of a, I don't know if you want to elaborate more on it or.
Yes, this is, again, a very important area, because if we look at what is happening with machine learning and AI, we're able now to construct computer programs and devices that can do jobs better than human beings can. And most of the time, these jobs have been menial jobs, but with the advent of machine learning and deep learning, we're able to construct AI programs that can do cognitive tasks, sometimes better than humans can. So with the march of technology in this area, what should we be educating students in so that they'll be employable in the future? The Israeli author Yuval Harari talks about this a lot. He asks, what should we be teaching so we won't put students into what he calls the useless class, people who don't have the skills to be able to find gainful employment in the future? I think this is a very important question for both academics and for policymakers to address of what should we be teaching for the future. I'm very fond of saying that computer science, like many fields, is a field in which you should engage in lifelong learning, because if I only knew what I knew when I graduated from Princeton, I'd be absolutely obsolete at this point. And it's only by having interacted with the people at Bell Labs, done research, done teaching, interacted with users and customers, that I've been able to gain an appreciation of where the important problems are and where we could extend the technology, and in doing so, create employment for new products in these arenas. So this is a great question. I don't have a full answer to it, but other than to say lifelong learning, it's enjoyable, so enjoy.
Yeah. Related to computational thinking, there is another question that the audience asked. It says, as computation and computational thinking becomes ever more important, how can we adapt programming languages to make them accessible to a wider audience?
Oh, this is a really fun question, because my observation is that if you collect a group of computer programmers together and ask them, what's the world's best programming language? World War III will erupt, because there's nothing that brings out the passion in programmers than discussing what is the ideal programming language, or what is currently the best programming language. It's maybe even worse than asking what is the best natural language in the world. There's no easy answer, simple answer to this question. But if we look at the development of programming languages have been around, the major languages, since the 1950s, where Fortran, Lisp, and COBOL were developed. And even today, there is an estimate that there are 200 billion lines of legacy COBOL code that are still being used by banks, financial institutions. I suspect maybe Columbia in its administrative systems still has a few COBOL programs that are still being used. So there's an enormous amount of software in the world, and the search is for languages that are easy for programmers to write programs in, algorithms in, that solve problems efficiently, but ones that they can readily write down. The problem with a legacy language like COBOL is that the language is somewhat baroque. I could say a lot baroque, that it's not taught in academia as a first language anymore. Maybe it wasn't taught as a first language very often, but it's an important language from a business perspective and legacy perspective. there is a great deal of interest in different styles of programming languages, of whether you want an imperative language like Fortran, where you specify how a task is to be done, what sequence of steps to take, or functional languages where you specify what should be done in higher level terms, but you don't specify how it should be done. Ultimately, it would be great if you could have a language that says, create world peace, and you give that to a compiler, and then out comes the program that creates world peace. But I don't think that's going to be possible, at least not in the near future.
Not anytime soon, yeah. So talking about languages, another question asks, what is, let me see, where's the question? Yeah. Actually, it's not there anymore, but let me ask you something else. These two questions are maybe related. One is, what is important to you right now? And then there is another question, what are your thoughts on quantum computing?
Okay.
So you can take either of them or both of them.
Well, having retired from Columbia, I've been able to dabble and look into a number of areas that have always fascinated me. One of the things that interests me is it possible to design a utopia, a form of government, and a way of structuring society where everyone is happy? If I look at the state of governments and politics in the world, even in the United States, it's a sorry mess today. Is there any way we could fix that? But this gets into realms that I'm totally ignorant of. How do you orient people, persuade people to do the right thing, even persuading people that they should get vaccinated to protect themselves and their family? It seems like a difficult task. It sounds like a no-brainer to me, but why are people so reluctant to protect themselves and their friends and families? So let's go to something that's much more manageable, namely quantum computing. So quantum computing is a fascinating area to me because it uses an abstraction. If we go back to our thinking on computational thinking, the abstraction underlying quantum computing is quantum mechanics. This is a theory of physics that was developed in the first quarter of the 20th century to explain the behavior of subatomic particles. It's one of the most successful theories that physicists have developed. And recently, in the last couple of decades, people have been trying to use phenomena at the subatomic level to create computers that can do computation. But the model of computation in quantum computing is very different from the model of computation that you see in today's traditional programming languages like C, C++, or Java, or Rust, or whatever, because it looks at the behavior, in some sense, the model of the principles underlying quantum mechanics. And here is why I think knowing fundamentals is important. If we look at, say, Nielsen and Chung's Bible of quantum computation and quantum computing, they have 4 postulates that describe quantum mechanics. And the first postulate says that the state of an isolated physical system, quantum mechanical system, can be described by a unit vector in complex Hilbert space. So you just have a vector in Hilbert space, and that describes the state of a physical system. The second postulate says that the evolution of a quantum mechanical system can be described by a unitary transform on this vector in Hilbert space. So it's basically a rotation of that vector. The next postulate says that if you combine two quantum mechanical systems, you take the tensor product of their underlying Hilbert spaces. I won't go into the details of what a tensor product is. And then the most interesting postulate is that if you want to get information out of a quantum mechanical system, you have to apply a measurement to it. And the measurement only returns a classical bit 0 or a 1, whereas this unit vector in in complex Hilbert space is the model of a qubit, a quantum bit, and it has two complex numbers in it, two real numbers in it to describe its state. So the mathematical underpinnings of quantum computing are very interesting. There's a lot of talk about quantum computing being the method of computation in the future, but we have a long, long way to go before we can realize this, because we first need scalable quantum computers. Companies like IBM and Google can only construct quantum computers with 50 or 100 qubits in it currently. And if you want to do something really interesting with a quantum computer, like factor integers using Shor's algorithm, you need a quantum computer with 1 million or more qubits. So we have a long way to go to construct scalable quantum computers. And the other aspect is that we still need lots more interesting and useful quantum algorithms. So it's a great area to experiment with in coming up with algorithms for computation. So it's promising, but it's very much in its infancy, and very few newspaper reporters and journalists really understand what quantum computing is about.
Mm-hmm. So maybe that relates to, let me say one more question. Ho Nguyen asks, would you still work on compilers if you were starting out in the field today? And if not, what other areas would you explore today if you were starting out again? What do you recommend to a fresh student that is just starting now?
Well, what I would suggest to any student starting out is learn the basics of computer science and learn the basics of an application domain. So let's say we take computational biology. So learn computer science, learn biology, and then try to apply the ideas of computer science to solving problems in biology. Where biology is still has a lot of interesting unsolved problems, which I think if we could find the right abstractions with which to think about them and solve them, would provide great benefit to humankind. So I would pick computational biology, and I could go into much more details of some of the little languages that I had in mind for experimenting with computational biology, that if you transpose 2 of the amino acids in the DNA of a chromosome, what impact would that have on the organism that develops? I talked to a biologist on what do simple permutations of amino acids in the human DNA do. And he says, we can only do that experimentally. We don't know how to theoretically determine what impact it would have. So creation of new vaccines, there have been great strides in some of the mRNA technology, but I think being able to devise new medicines, new vaccines, that would be a great application domain. So that would be what I would choose, but you should choose what application area you're interested in. Not everyone may be interested in biology.
Yeah, and that's computing becomes more important in more different and more diverse areas. There is the number of choices, it's only increasing. There is lots of other interesting questions, and I think time is getting now towards the end of the hour. I want to mention there is like a student of your class that has asked a question. Somebody that worked for you at Belcor and commented that that was the best time of his career or her career. So there is would be a lot more to get to, but I think we are approaching the end now. It was a very illuminating conversation and lots of wisdom that you gave us. And I want to thank you for the conversation. I want to thank you for the audience for their attention and for all the stimulating questions. I'm going to pass on the microphone now to Cambis for concluding.
Thank you so much, Professor Yannakakis, and thanks so much, Professor Aho, for your wisdom. I just want to quickly mention that the recording of this event would be rendered, and basically a link to it would be provided within 24 hours to 48 hours after this. So be on the lookout for that. Just one brief comment. Any final comment, Professor Aho, do you have for us before we close it?
Well, I'd just like to thank Mihalis for taking the time to ask these questions. And I wish I could have much more time to interact and talk about the future of computer science, but maybe sometime in the future.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, both. And we close it now, and hope you have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for attending, too.